Rocket TikTok today at log.rocket. See you on TikTok.
Hi there, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. LogRocket provides AI-first session replay and analytics which surface the UX and technical issues impacting user experiences. Start understanding where your users are struggling and try it for free at logrocket.com today. My name is Paul, and joining with me is Harry Roberts. He's a web performance consultant and Google developer expert, and we're going to be talking about how to think like a performance engineer. And boy, am I excited because this is something that, you might dance around a little bit. And we have you, Harry, here as an expert to really dig in. So welcome to the podcast. Excited to get into it.
Oh, man, thank you. Thank you for having me. I just checked today, and it's 2 years since I was last on PodRocket. So it's been a long time. So it's good to be back.
Yeah, it's all about performance engineering, and it sounds like that's your cup of tea. Were you always into performance engineering? Was that something that you championed at the forefront of your career, or is it something you pedaled into?
That's a really good question. It was kind of inevitable. So I was a front-end engineer at a company that dealt in, like real-time kind of stuff. So I got involved as a front-end developer. My job was to basically do CSS architecture and design systems work about, I want to say 13 years ago now, like a long time ago. And it was just inevitable that whatever we built had to be fast. And part of my job was building the front end for the real-time platform. It was all about how could we make it really fast. And I worked with a couple of performance engineers who worked very heavily on DevOps platform infrastructure. And as a result, I just got obsessed with what I could do to match up with their work on the front end. And then my consultancy career, I still started out doing design systems, CSS architecture. But the more I got fascinated with web perf, I steered myself in that direction quite deliberately.
It seems like that skill set has brought you to a lot of interesting places to work. I mean, Google, where else have you done? BBC, the Financial Times, the UN, Harry.
Yeah, I'm very privileged. I'm very fortunate. A lot of my career's propped up on just being in the right place at the right time. So I started out as a web developer in 2008, which is a good time to get into web dev because web standards were just becoming a thing. It wasn't difficult yet. Building websites wasn't difficult in 2008 because there was no such thing as NPM. There was no such thing as frameworks. It was just easier. So getting into the web at that kind of time meant I was set up to get into an industry with a very easy on-ramp. And then when I got into web perf, there were very few people available to do that kind of work, that kind of consultancy. So in my early career, sort of 10 years ago, I got to work with some amazing brands purely because I was the only person shouting about doing web perf. It's a much bigger industry now, much bigger scene, a very healthy competition. It means that the web perf community and the web perf sort of profession has really matured a lot in the last few years. I've worked with some phenomenal brands and I'm grateful every day. It's very cool.
When you had that first experience of doing the CSS framework and the design systems, was that sort of when you started to change your thinking about, because you said that's where you started to get a little more interested and dip your toes in, or was there an experience afterwards at some of these like bigger name brands that you feel like was a Starship experience that kind of shaped the next decade?
That's a really good question. And you know what? I'm trying to remember, even if I could remember who it was, I can't name them anyway because of like professional courtesy. I remember I was with a client once. I was doing a CSS workshop and we got to the end of the workshop and I was like, hey, we've got an hour left. Does anybody want to learn any web performance stuff? Because I'm thinking of writing a web performance workshop. And people were like, yeah, okay, cool. So we did a full 2-day CSS workshop and the last 1 hour that we had, I was trying a new routine. I was like, indulge me, see what you think of this material. And I just did a couple of hours about web perf just for free on the end of this CSS workshop. And people were like fascinated. And for me, that was a really good sort of test bed to just see if there was an appetite for it. That will have been maybe 2015, 2016. So yeah, 8 or 9 years ago now.
Interesting to hear from somebody who's been in the thick of it, how the industry is shaped over the years. And it does sound like that first experience really helped you get in, like personally excited about this field in this area of work. Do you feel like that really changed your thinking? I guess I'm going to segue into our first real question about what you do, Harry. What is it like to change your thinking into that frame of scope? What is it like to think like a performance engineer? What are one or two flagship heuristics that you were like, I think differently now in this new way?
So that for me is a really interesting question. It highlights something that I'm regretting very recently. So I did a talk about, I think in July. So that's 5 months ago, I gave a talk called How to Think Like a Performance Engineer. And I wrote the title before I wrote the talk, and I soon realized that title is a bit arrogant, right? How to think like a performance engineer sounds like we think better or we think different. So I think when I've come out with phrases like that in the past, what I really should have said is how to approach performance a little more pragmatically. And what I mean by that is just make your life a bit easier, be a bit easier on yourself. So to think like a performance engineer would be to look at numbers a lot and always trust numbers. But it's also, there's a reason why you're making a website or a web app fast, right? There's a reason you're doing it because it's going to have greater engagement. You'll get more donations if you are a charity. If you're e-com, you'll sell more product. The reason you're doing that is all down to the customer experience. So what really are you achieving? And how do you think more like a customer? Because I'm writing an article at the moment. It's unfinished, but I'm writing an article at the moment where I basically state that adding Apple Pay to your checkout will make you more money than web performance. People will convert better if they've got an easy way to pay you than if the page is slightly faster. And that's coming from me as a performance engineer. So I think my point about thinking like a performance engineer is about thinking a little bit more like your customer and thinking a little bit more about like, why are we even here? If we think a faster experience is better, what else makes a better experience? And thinking a little more holistically about that and understanding that web perf is like one part of a much bigger puzzle.
Yeah, in that example, it's conversions, right? You want to convert as many people as possible.
Exactly.
There could be a lot of things that help, a lot of tools that get you there. Interesting. That wasn't the answer I was expecting, but that's super interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
I think that surprised a lot of my own clients. So I once had a company get in touch with me and they were like, oh, we want to make our CSS. This is years ago. Can you come down to our office, just do like a 1-day workshop? We want to make our CSS better. I looked at their product and I was like, what you're building is really important. This is it was like a good and in here thing to build. It wasn't like the next Uber for pets. It was like a good thing. And I was like, no one cares about your CSS. Not even you at this point should care about your CSS. What you're building is a really good thing that should exist. So don't spend money on CSS. Go and spend it on UX and researchers and make sure that people using your application who are in distress, it was an application designed for people who've had some bad news and they just want to see what their next steps are. And I was like, don't spend money on CSS, spend it on researchers, spend it on user research and finding out what people who are in distress, who need your application, how they're feeling at the time. And don't worry about your code. No one cares about the code at this point. Go and think about the actual person turning up and what do they need to achieve. Because I promise you Flexbox won't fix that.
The kill-all tool.
Sorry, that sounded really, I don't know. It's just a really interesting part of my career is that the fastest website, I could just delete all their images, delete all their CSS, delete all their JavaScript, and they've got the fastest website. That's not going to work for anyone.
If we started to look a little bit about the times that your expertise in web perf actually pertain to that user story, the user experience, the conversion, I'd like to talk about some of the tools they use, Harry. Like, for example, Core Web Vitals. I've heard them. I've actually talked to people here on PodRocket about them, but I don't know much about them. What is a Core Web Vital? Is it something you use, or is it one of those things that we talk about and don't use as much as they're actually leveraged in the real world?
That's a really good question. So Core Web Vitals, I'm going to start by saying I like Core Web Vitals. I am a fan of Core Web Vitals. Core Web Vitals are a good indicator. They don't guarantee a good user experience. But if you are like me into cycling, your FTP, your functional threshold power, is a measure of how much power you can produce for 1 hour. Or your VO2 max is all about your aerobic strength. Or you might have BMI as a very rough measure of height to weight ratio. You might have a really good BMI, but be really unfit. So you might have other things that mean you're not a healthy person, but you've got a good BMI. Or the opposite could be true. You could have a terrible BMI, but be in really good shape. Core Web Vitals are similar. They're a measure of your website that if your Core Web Vitals are good, then the user experience should be good. There are always other ways that it might be contradictory. Measuring user experience, the only real way you can do that is to interview every single user you have, which not going to happen. So Core Web Vitals are a suite of metrics designed primarily around site speed that can be measured quite easily without having to ask individual users, without having to take any subjectivity into account. And you can use these 3 different metrics. So the 3 Core Web Vitals are 3 metrics designed by Google, and each of them measure a different thing about site speed. And if you pass one or all 3 of them, you probably have a nice website in terms of user experience and site speed. It's not a guarantee. You could build a site with a really good Core Web Vitals suite, but that is horrible to use. But it's a good predictor of site speed. They're just simply three metrics that genuinely do a lot of very good work to contextualize user experience in terms of site speed. And it's the first time, really, at a large scale, we've ever managed to do that. The three Core Web Vitals are largest contentful paint. When was the biggest bit of content available on screen? So if you're buying a pair of sneakers, how quickly could I see that image of the sneakers is a good measure of user experience. Interaction to next paint is when I click add to cart, how quickly could that pair of sneakers be added to my cart? And the third metric is cumulative layout shift. And that is when I click next in the carousel, if the next image isn't ready yet, does the page move down when the next image of the sneakers arrives? So there are three different site speed performance metrics that try and measure how a user might experience your page, specifically in context of how fast or slow it is.
Are those typically what you would reach to first? And as a quick follow-up question, what are like ancillary metrics that you would lob into something that feels like, acts like, behaves like a Core Web Vital?
Oh, okay. Part one, yes, I would reach to those very first. The reason I would do that is because now, even in the short amount of time, 4 years sounds like a long time, but for more than 4 years now, Core Web Vitals have become the standard. So they're very easily accessible, very easily available. Most of my clients already understand them. So absolutely, that's the first thing that I would reach to. The first measurements I would take would be Core Web Vitals. Beyond that, I would look at custom metrics. So things like, okay, the largest bit of content might be useful for an e-commerce website, but if you're a banking application, you log into your internet banking, the biggest bit of content is probably your bank's logo, and you're probably not too interested in how fast that was. You probably want to know how quickly you could see your current balance or not see that. If you're like me, I don't want to know what's in there. So custom metrics like how quickly could I see, not the largest bit of content, but how quickly could I see the search box, or how quickly could I see the first search result, for example. Most things will land near Core Web Vitals anyway, because they're very, very well researched. So most things will be, how quickly could I see something? How quickly could I do something? Like, how long did it take to add this to a cart? How long did it take to get from page one of the products to page two? So I think Core Web Vitals are the easiest place to start. And almost anything you would measure at the moment is an extension of them.
And would that include what I would lob into that category of ancillary metrics that you would look at? They're derivatives of the Core Web Vital, thinking of like time.
Apologies, I get what you mean now. My ancillary metrics would be custom metrics, so time to see the search box, etc. However, you're absolutely right. There are metrics that already exist. So time to first byte is a really good one. Time to first byte is how long did the server, actually it's a lot of things, but it's roughly how long did it take the server to deliver this response? That's a really good predictor for performance. So I'd look at things like that for definite.
So one reaction that I think a lot of people have, and I say a lot of people, maybe in my personal community of developers, of people who are like halfway through their career, learning about this stuff, trying to improve on this stuff. We hear about all these things, but it's okay. But the really like senior staff engineers take care of that, right? Like it sounds very nebulous on how to do this unless you actually build and deploy your own site that actually has traffic. So when you're diagnosing, when you're consulting with people, where do you usually find most of the weight being shed? Where do you find places to look and patterns that you've developed in terms of searching for problematic areas over the years?
It varies from site to site. The quickest way to find out what a specific site is suffering from is to start at something like the largest contentful paint and work backwards. So, for example, if you've got really late largest contentful paint, is that because your image was super badly optimized? And you can quite quickly work that out, and you can work back. So it's detective work. Whatever page lands in your browser, you've got to work back through everything that happened to get that page there in the first place. Most of the weight happens on the front end. Almost all slowdowns that I find, almost all, with a very small handful of exceptions, most of the weight happens on the front end. People throwing JavaScript at problems that simply can't solve, so the problem simply gets worse. So generally where I tend to find most of the optimization opportunities is on the front end somewhere. Server-side rendering has really taken a chunk out of that. So the JavaScript issues now aren't normally to do with client-side rendering. They're normally to do with interacting to next paint or responsiveness and sluggishness within an application. I can think of 2 exceptions this entire year, and it's 11th of December now. This entire year, I've only met 2 websites where the back end was the problem. Every other site I've worked on, it's been all on the front end. So that's where I'd normally look first, because it's usually where the problem exists.
How do you put a site through its paces if you don't necessarily have a problematic poster child or scapegoat to throw under the bus? Is there a perf testing suite? Is there like a playwright or something that you use, a tool? And I assume you have some tests that you run things through. Synthetic test, you throw data at it. There's also, let me look at your real world data. Let me look at your real world metrics. How do you balance those and what types of tools do you use to help diagnose?
That's a really good question, because there's so many it depends here. So when a client gets in touch with me, they think they have a slow website, and they might do, they might not do, but for some reason they've emailed me. So my first question is, why do you think it's slow? And it could be that, customers keep complaining the site is slow. And do you know what? A lot of times customers actually mean the site is down. And it's like, that's not slow, that's just dead. So I've had it in the past where clients think, our customers keep saying the site is slow to respond. Like, no, what they mean is it's down. They refresh for a 10th time and it's back. You don't need a performance engineer, you need site reliability. So normally I start by asking my clients, why do you think why have you emailed me? Why do you think it's slow? Then as part of that process, I will ask them, okay, what's a critical user journey for you? So if you're an insurance company, a critical user journey will be filling out your forms to get your insurance quote. E-commerce, landing page, search bar, search results page, checkout flow. For whatever site it is, we look at critical user journeys. We define several of those, and then I will use web page test, which is the gold standard in web performance engineering. And I'll write automated web page tests to do that user journey. So land on a page, accept a cookie banner or reject a cookie banner, add a product to the cart, change the quantity to 5, go to the checkout, etc., etc. I'll script all of that. And what you'll see is that what most people do is they will test the home page, then they'll test a search page, search results page, product page. They'll test them all individually. The problem is a customer doesn't go to your home page, then clear their cache and then go to your products page, and then clear their cache and go to your checkout page. They go one after the other. And this is what I mean about thinking like a performance engineer. If you measure each of those pages in isolation, every single page is going to look really bad. Whereas if you've got most of the files in cache from the first page view, by the time you're on your second page, it's a little bit faster. And the third page is even faster. By the time you're on the fourth page, nearly everything you need came from browser cache already. So the last page is like lightning fast. And that's the importance of measuring these user journeys, because you can see the gradual improvement in performance as you go through the site. And you can also see if you've got an improvement, and this drops here, you know that, okay, something happened on this page where all the cumulative gains we've made were lost. And that's how you find the bottlenecks in a slightly more realistic scenario, like a user journey.
And every step of the way, as you're doing this custom scripting, testing, recording, I assume, core web vitals, and you mentioned other custom metrics on top of that. So you can, because our listeners can't see, but Harry's painted a line graph. And in my brain, I'm thinking, I started out as an SRE, Harry, like back in the day. And I'm thinking, wow, it'd be really great to see like how the response time is changing, where people are connecting, there's a slowdown. So are these metrics that you would collect over time and then put in some time series so you could analyze and view?
Yeah, so it depends what tooling you're using. So web page test is synthetic. So you could collect that daily and store that somewhere in a big data lake and then just view that at the end of however long. Or if you've got the correct monitoring tools, the correct run, do that on a session-based basis. Does that make sense? But for me, it's more like on a micro level. So rather than looking at hundreds of users worth of data, let's just script one test and see where they normally pop up on a very small scale. So it could be that for the first page is 2.1 seconds, the next page is 1.9, then it's 1.7, then it's 2.3. It's wait, faster, slower, something's gone wrong. And that 2.3 is the anomaly from just a very small data set of maybe 5 data points. Right. And that could be larger contentful paint, but that could be amount of bytes transferred. That could be total blocking time. Any metric you chose to look at, you would identify on a very micro level to start with, because you have to start on a very small scale. Then you zoom out, you release things. Okay, this has been live for a month now. Do those anomalies still exist? Have we fixed it? And work from that kind of perspective.
The cold start, warm start of the user journey through the website is super interesting. Something I've personally never really thought of, because coming from like a more SRE background, doing backend engineering, it's like a very unit test heavy, and that's how I would view testing a web page. But this is like proof in the pudding. You really have to. That's not how the user is going to use the product.
Right,
So
exactly, right?
why test it
Exactly.
like that?
Yeah. Think of a tool like PageSpeed Insights or Lighthouse. Somebody runs a test for the homepage and then the product page, then the checkout page. You run 3 Lighthouse tests, you're going to get 3 cookie banners. But your customer isn't going to see 3 cookie banners. They're going to click the first one, and the second page, there isn't a cookie banner. The third page, there isn't a cookie banner. There's no point testing every page like it's the first time it's ever been seen. You need to test pages like it's the first time someone's seen them, absolutely. At some point, every person saw your page for the first time. If someone's in the middle of a user journey, checkout pages are a great example. It's impossible to go straight to a checkout page. You must have been to a product page first. So don't ever test a checkout page as if it's the first time someone's seen it, because that's an impossibility. They've got there somehow. So design the journey they went on. I had a client who they were testing their website.com/checkout, and they were testing it every day. They'd run tests, and it looked really fast. I looked at their testing because I came onto the project after they'd set the monitoring up, and I looked at their testing and I was like, wow, yeah, this page is really fast. Let me take a look. And you look at the test and the page just says, there are no products in your cart. I'm like, why are you testing an empty cart? That makes no sense. Someone hasn't gone to an empty cart page. You need to pre-populate that with some items. And that was a real blind spot in their testing, because once we scripted a user journey to add something to the cart and then go to the checkout, we found that, unfortunately, the page was way slower because the page had to load images of the products, whereas before it just said, there are no items in your cart. So it was like a real blind spot for them.
Are there any things up that same alley that people are just like totally missing the mark on when it comes to perf monitoring, perf engineering, that you just feel like people are generally misguided at looking? I love the user journey one. That's a really cool one of like how the page is actually going to be used, how the product is going to be used. That's a very common gap. Is there another big gap like that?
Yeah, and you know what? I think that performance engineers and monitoring companies themselves are guilty of this. You mentioned it already briefly, I'm sure. You said about synthetic versus real user data. So there's a real misconception between the monitoring and synthetic monitoring. And the problem is that people call synthetic monitoring, and it isn't. Real user monitoring is constantly looking at how people are using your site. And when a user comes to your site, as a site owner, I don't get to choose if they have an iPhone or an Android, if they're on LTE, 3G, or fiber. I don't get to choose any of these things. So there are a million variables at once. Whereas synthetic testing, I have to make some assumptions. Oh, I'm going to choose a Samsung Galaxy S22. I'm going to choose a 4G connection. I'm going to choose New York as my test location. All these assumptions you have to make. And then if you run that test every day, nothing's changed. And all you're doing is really testing variation in tests. I think the point I'm trying to get here is synthetic testing is for testing purposes, not monitoring. And I've spoken yesterday to a huge company. You've heard of them. We've all heard of them. An enormous company. I got a phone call yesterday and they were asking me, hey, so we want to transform our synthetic monitoring. And I was like, look, if you really want to transform your synthetic monitoring, do not offer synthetic monitoring to your customers. If you just boot up the same page, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you load the same page, test it with the same browser on the same connection speed, with the same geographic location, nothing's going to change because nothing has changed. You're just going to get the same results every single day. That's not monitoring.
No, right.
That's not a real person. I'm the best example of getting this wrong. So earlier this year, my site never changes. It's a statically generated site. Every blog post is a markdown file. It doesn't even have a CMS. And one day, all of a sudden, last year, my site got loads faster. Just out of nowhere, my site got loads faster. And I was like, I don't remember changing anything. Let me go and check. And it turns out it was a third-party script that had got way faster. I was like, oh, no way. Twitter's updated their Twitter widget to be a lot faster. And I looked at day 1 versus day 2, and even though the Twitter widget was a lot faster, the checksum was the same. The file hadn't changed at all. So I was like, wait, for the last 3 months, the Twitter widget took this many milliseconds. So the last 3 weeks, it's taken half that time. But the file hasn't changed. My site hasn't changed. What on earth has changed? When I looked at my settings in my synthetic testing tool, it had upgraded itself from Chrome 119 to a Chrome 131. So the browser had just got 11
Right.
versions better. So the browsers like V8 must have got faster. Some internal
Right.
optimizations must have got better. If you're using synthetic for monitoring, all you're doing is testing the variation in test results. If nothing else changes, if the browser, the location, the test speed, the page, if they remain the same, and you test the site every single day, you shouldn't expect to see any changes. And if you do, it's probably because the test itself has changed. I realize that was a really long answer to a very short question, but I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions, even at the highest level, that people get.
Oh, that's
And that's why
interesting.
people get really annoyed when they try and use Lighthouse. Oh, every time we do a release, we run Lighthouse. Yeah, but you're not going to get any different results because it's not a real user. It's not a real person. You can't average it out across the tens of thousands of people a day you have visiting your site. You should not really expect to see much variation. If you use synthetic as a monitoring tool, you're not going to spot the things you need to spot. Using synthetic in a response to a deploy, or maybe if you do change something on the site and you've changed it, then run some synthetic tests.
As like a common basis, right?
Exactly. Just using synthetic as a monitoring tool, you're not going to find the things you're looking for. And it will probably mislead you, if nothing else.
One big takeaway I'm getting from this last question that we're wrapping up with here is just you really need to understand what you're testing for to use the right test or the right metric or whatever it is. You really have to make sure it's the right heuristic that you're sidetailing out.
Yeah, exactly. Like you should know that, if we've released something to do with image optimization, we shouldn't expect any change in time to first byte, right? We shouldn't expect server time to go up if we made images smaller. So make sure whatever you know you're changing, you measure it in the right place. I have a friend called Tim Parica. He's Belgian. He works for Akamai. He's got an amazing talk all about setting up RUM monitoring or like RUM tooling to be hyper accurate and getting rid of noise. Like he talks about, got some numbers, and it's 17% of the data your RUM tool picks up is just noise. It's just useless. And 17% is a huge number. And he talks about getting rid of that immediately, and your problems become way more obvious. It's a really great talk. So I'll give some show notes for that.
Yeah, we can definitely include them in the description. Harry, are you ready for our new round that we have at the end, the quick fire? I think the general temperature is let's try to see if you can bottle up an answer in 30 to 45 seconds for each one.
That's a big ask from me. I'm sorry.
Okay. What's the one metric every performance engineer should always prioritize? Oh my God, that's a cruel one.
Whichever one makes the most sense for their company. That's an expensive thing to work out. But I've got a client where INP is more important than LCP for them. So I've told them, don't ignore LCP, but we can see in the data INP affects your conversion rate more than LTP. It's expensive to get to knowing that about your own company. But once you get there, whatever moves the needle most for you is the metric you should focus on.
I love that you gave the it depends answer without saying it depends. That was eloquent. 10 out of 10.
Thank you, man.
What's the biggest performance myth you wish people would stop believing?
Ooh. Okay, controversial. That JavaScript is bad. JavaScript is great. You need JavaScript. JavaScript makes things more accessible. JavaScript makes things better. In fact, my friend Nolan Lawson said, give me any website and I can show you how I can make it better with JavaScript. JavaScript isn't the devil. JavaScript isn't bad. The obsession with JavaScript is bad, or looking to JavaScript to solve problems that the browser can do already is bad. So I guess the myth is use JavaScript usefully. It's not a bad thing. Just don't use it where it isn't needed. So I'm not anti-JavaScript. I'm anti using the wrong tool for the wrong job.
If there was one tool, you could use a performance tool or something that helps you achieve your consultation of performance engineering for the rest of your career, what would that one tool be?
Web page test every time. Big ups to Pat Meenan, big ups to Catchpoint, and big ups to web page test. Web page test is the gold standard. So if I could only choose one tool for the rest of my career, it would be web page test.
What's the fastest way to spot a slow website?
The fastest way to spot a slow website. If you notice a friend is annoyed by it, then it must be really bad. I'm like predisposed to being like, that spinner was there too long. There must be something wrong with it. If I see a friend complaining that a website is slow, I'm like, that must be a bad website. I'm not very tolerant because I can see exactly why. So I think that's probably a good tell. From a more technical perspective, any big gaps between first contentful and largest contentful paint is probably going to be client-side rendered. That's how you tell.
Last one. What's the most overlooked tip for making a website lightning fast? Because it must be just get rid of all the JavaScript.
Yeah. The first thing I do on any project, my first tip to make a website faster, I just call it containment. Whatever you're doing right now, just contain it so it doesn't get any worse. So tighten up your caching strategies. Make sure things like back forward cache is working nice and fast. Make sure that you're using things like the speculation rules API. So basically, most people think that making a website faster means tearing it down and rebuilding it, or very expensive reworks. My advice is just take whatever you're doing right now and safeguard that so it can get no slower. Tighten up your caching strategies. Make sure things like speculation rules can be implemented and are being implemented. Make sure things like back forward cache means if someone hits the back button, it's at least nice and quick for them. So yeah, containment. Just whatever you're doing now, don't let it get any worse. That's the simplest tip.
Containment. Don't let it get any worse. That's a good note to end on. Harry, you mentioned putting things in the show notes. What about you? If people want to hear, you mentioned your website. Do you blog there? People want to learn more about perf testing?
Yeah, so I write a lot, and I'm writing a lot at the moment. I feel like I've fallen back in love with writing. I picked my domain name when I was 17 years old. So it's csswizardry.com. And you can find everything there on any social network. I am CSS Wizardry. That's the benefit of having a really lame username. It's always available. Any new social network, I can guarantee that I can get CSS Wizardry as a username because no one else wants it.
And it's memorable. Like, it's not just like your name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's memorable, but I sometimes forget how lame it is. I'm so used to it.
It has the old internet charm, Harry. It's CSS Wizardry. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can throw a link for that in the description so people can link right to you.
That would be great.
CSS Wizardry.
Yeah, exactly. I'm easy to find.
Great. Thank you so much, Harry. I definitely learned a lot today getting the opportunity to speak to you. So we'll look forward to having you on again, hopefully not in 2 years.
Yeah, no, let's do it.
Pleasure.
It's a treat to be on, man. So thank you so much for having me.